In this lesson, we'll learn how to set the resolution of our simulation and how that affects the time it takes to simulate the actual fluids. So I have this scene here, and imagine it's from, I don't know, a mouse's point of view in the gutter, and somebody above has just spilled water and it's going to come through this grate. So let's rewind, and we'll go ahead and hit play and look and see what we've got. Now, our simulation comes pretty quickly, and the water comes through the grate. Well, kind of comes through the grate. Actually, it doesn't really separate very well around the bars of the grate. That's because we're working with a fairly low resolution simulation. Now, simulation resolution is actually set inside the Autodop network, so let's dive inside and come over to the Flip Object node, or Flip Object 1 here, Flip Fluid Object 1. Now, the first parameter you'll find is particle separation. Now, particle separation is what defines the fluid, the number of particles in the fluid. Now, the particle separation is not exactly like a really clear term on how it sets resolution. So I want you to look at this cube and think about the distance or space between the particles of this cube. All right, so there's a pretty significant gap there. We can take the particle separation to a lower value, something like, say, 0.05. Oh, I typed 0.05. That's my bad. Let's just go ahead and right-click. We'll revert that to defaults. At defaults, it's 0.1. So let's make it 0.05. We're going to basically double the resolution. And you can see what happened. We have a ton more particles. However, they're much closer to each other. They're much closer packed. In other words, the separation between the particles is less. So there's more of them. So we have to have more particles to make the shape of our initial fluid. If we have a smaller separation, we have a larger resolution of fluid. So a 0.025, now we have really tiny particles. In fact, it's even hard for me to zoom around in my viewport. We have so many particles, and they're so close together, you can see here, that are trying to define that sphere, or that cube, that we should get really good looking fluids now. The only problem with this is, as you might imagine, it takes a lot longer to get to that look. So now that we have this many particles that we're going to try to simulate, let's rewind our timeline, ensure that we have real-time playback turned on, and just click play and see what kind of simulation times we're looking at. So it's much, much slower to calculate. By now, I believe we already would have seen the fluid through the grates. However, it wasn't actually going through the grates. It was kind of not separating as it fell. Now, at this resolution of 0.025, with that many more particles, you can see how much slower it is to calculate. In fact, we're working through the next frame, just one frame at a time. There it comes. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the timeline right now. I'm going to pan around in my viewport just a little bit here. We'll jump back up to object level so we can really see that surface. And man, you can see the resolution of the fluid simulation now is much, much better. I mean, it really does start to look like fluid that's fallen through a grate. We've got the clean separation. We don't have any of the fluid actually being sucked in by the geometry. None of it's disappearing in the geometry. It's all bending around the geometry. But you saw how much longer it takes to calculate. Now, I did do a scene of a river, and I want to show you the difference that particle separation can make on simulation times. So let's see what we have here. We have a basic riverbed, and we have some particles that come flowing down through the river and collide with a couple of obstacles here in the riverbed. Now, this particular simulation was rendered at a 0.25 particle separation, and the entire simulation, this one thing that you're looking at here, took about 1 minute to simulate. So that's not so bad. But you can also see that we're losing a lot of detail. As the water rushes over the rock here, it just basically swallows it up and it disappears. Same thing almost happens here. The water almost just takes over the rock completely and you don't even know that it's there. So we'll add a little extra particle separation here, lower our particle separation, add some more particles. Now this next one, was done using a particle separation of 0.1 instead of 0.25. And you can now begin to see that we're getting this sort of threading that's happening as these strands of fluid break into separate little strands. You can see through this rock a little bit more. You can start to see the separation of fluids here. You've got a lot more detail as we round the corner. Watch right here. See how we round the corner here. We're starting to get a little bit of curl and backflow here. Okay, and now we're going to take it up to the max. Now this simulation here took 6 minutes. Okay, at a particle separation of 0.1. Now this simulation here has a 0.033 particle separation, and it took 36 minutes to simulate this out. However, look at the change in the resolution here. This rock is no longer completely swallowed up. In fact, all of the fluid is splitting correctly, and it's starting to do this really nice webbing of fluid around the surface of the rock. And look at around this curve, how the water breaks around this curve correctly. It's no longer coming up over the top of this second rock. It's actually breaking correctly around the angle and then sweeping around the front of the rock as it should in real world. However, it did take me 36 minutes as opposed to 1 minute to get this kind of detail. So this is how particle separation and resolution of simulation can impact what you're working on. But keep in mind, when you're working at the very beginning of your project, you want to work at a higher particle separation with fewer particles. As you begin to refine the look of your project, you want to turn that down until you get to a point that you can stand it. Basically, you want your simulations to be as high resolution as necessary. Not necessarily as possible, but as necessary. So there's a quick look at particle separation and the resolution of simulations and how it can impact your simulations. Go ahead and stop that. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at pump and sink objects.